Maps. Most old cities and the neighborhoods in them weren't planned in anticipation of a tremendous population growth. Generally speaking, the layout of the roads is originally in response to geographical restrictions and the necessity of connecting points of economic importance. Once the connecting roads are established, new businesses and roads are positioned strategically along the existing skeleton, and eventually the paths carved into the earth are immortalized in asphalt, leaving room only for minor modifications, additions, and alterations, but rarely a dramatic change. If that is true, then my childhood neighborhood must have been old. If straight lines move as the crow flies, then my neighborhood must have been built based on the travels of a snake. The first houses would have been placed around the lake, I'm sure, and while older, these houses were the nicest in the neighborhood. Gradually, the inhabitable area increased as new extensions were built off the original path, but these new extensions all ended abruptly at one point or another. All the neighborhood streets converged into a single strip of pavement that connected with the road into town. This was the only legitimate way either in or out of the neighborhood. A tributary, which both fed and drank from the lake, limited many of these extensions as it bifurcated the woods before passing right by the ditch. Many of the original homes had enormous yards, but some of those original plots, and all of the later lots, had been divided, leaving properties with smaller and smaller boundaries. An aerial view of my neighborhood would give one the impression that an enormous squid had once died in the woods, only to be found by some adventuring entrepreneur who paved roads over its tentacles, withdrawing his involvement to leave. Time, greed, and desperation to divide up the land between the roads among prospective homeowners like an embarrassing attempt at the golden ratio. Our house was on a small rectangle of land, but we had a front and backyard. This was a luxury that would be eliminated over time as there were some residents who shared patches of land that were as big as the one upon which my house was placed. Even still, developers were carting in and assembling new modular homes, and families were continuing to park their trailer homes on smaller and smaller lots. The neighborhood had been undergoing this expansion for a long time. From my porch, you could see the old houses that surrounded the lake, and while these were all beautiful, the house of Mrs. Maggie was my favorite. It was an off-white, colonial-style house, though it was more modest than what that style typically offers. There was only one story, though a trinity of false windows extending off the lowest part of the roof convinced me that there were at least two. Her porch wrapped around her house all the way to the back where it grew an appendage that moved down a slightly sloping hill and became a dock once it settled on the water. Like many of the yards with nicer homes on them, Mrs. Maggie's had a sprinkler system that was on a timer, though at some point over the years, her timer must have broken because the sprinklers would come on at various points during the day, and often even at night, all year. While it never got cold enough to snow where I lived, several times each winter I would go outside in the morning to see Mrs. Maggie's yard transformed into a surreal Arctic paradise by the frozen water from her sprinklers. Every other yard stood sterilized and arid by the biting frost of the winter's cold, but right there in the middle of the bleak reminder of the savagery of the season was an oasis of beautiful ice, hanging like stalactites from every branch of every tree and every leaf of every bush. As the sun rose, its light spread through her trees, and each piece of ice splintered the rays into a rainbow that could only be viewed briefly before it blinded you. Even as a child, I was struck by how beautiful it was, and often Josh and I would go over there to walk on the iced grass and have sword fights with the icicles. Mrs. Maggie was, as best as I can remember, around 80 years old, and was one of the friendliest and sweetest people I had ever met, despite her quirks. She had a head of loose-set white curls and always wore light dresses with floral patterns over her frail, but not sickly, body. When it was warm and Josh and I would go swimming in the lake, she would sit out on her back porch and just talk with us. She never brought a book or a magazine, never had a crossword puzzle or a word search. I think she came out on those days just to visit. Sometimes we would swim out nearly to the center of the oval lake, and she would call us back, yelling not to swim too far, but we never listened. When we played close to the shore, she would ask us about school, and any time we told her what we were learning or what assignments we had, she would say that we should be thankful because she always had to work harder when she was our age. I once told her that we were building a spaceship. Mrs. Maggie said that we were getting off easy. While the last weeks of kindergarten played out, Josh and I found ourselves in the lake nearly every weekend, and so nearly every weekend Mrs. Maggie found herself out on her porch. The community group was wrapping up the balloon project, and on the day that we took our last pictures home, Josh had come to play at my house after school. Though the initial enthusiasm for the project had long since abated, taking all the Polaroids off the map and bringing them home had stirred the embers of our dwindling excitement. When we were swimming in the lake that day, Josh asked how far I thought a letter might go if we put it in a bottle and threw it into the ocean. We guessed at this until Mrs. Maggie, who was eavesdropping, interjected and said that it would depend on which ocean it was and what the currents were like. She said, as she gestured toward the tributary, that we could even throw it into the lake and it might travel hundreds of miles. I asked her if she thought the bottle would go farther than a balloon, and she looked at me quizzically as if she expected me to elaborate. I thought she already knew about the balloon project. I thought I had explained it to her before, but I told her about it anyway. She said that she had never heard of an experiment exactly like that, and that it sounded wonderful. Her husband, Tom, was a pilot, and she joked that if one of our balloons had been caught on the wing of his plane, it could have ended up on the other side of the world. Mrs. Maggie said that Tom should be home any day and that she would ask him if he saw any balloons in the sky while he was flying. She was smiling so cheerfully that I didn't want to upset her by pointing out that she had already told us that joke months ago. When Josh and I started paddling toward the shore, Mrs. Maggie invited us in for snacks. This was fairly routine. She would laugh and say that she had made too much food or lemonade and would gesture enthusiastically for us to walk up the dock and onto her porch. It was a tempting offer, especially when it was hot outside or we had tread water for too long, but we would always decline as politely as young boys knew how. Mrs. Maggie wasn't a stranger, but despite how kind she was, we were never comfortable enough with her to accept her invitation. I don't know what Josh's reservations were, exactly, but mine began the day I met Mrs. Maggie. The first time I met her was the first time my mother let me walk home from the bus stop by myself. For the first few weeks of kindergarten, my mom had made arrangements with her employer to pick me up from school, but this meant that to make up for the lost time, she would have to leave me at our house alone for about an hour each day. We didn't live very far from my elementary school, but the lines to pick up the students were always long, so long, in fact, that the students who rode the bus would often make it back to their houses before we made it back to ours. Eventually my mom relaxed enough to let me ride the bus, and she would meet me with her car where the bus dropped me off. Many of the other kids that shared my bus stop, however, had their own keys to their houses, and I would get into my mom's car and watch them run and skip home with their keys dangling around their necks or swinging from their hands. This made me jealous. I pleaded with my mom to let me travel as freely as the other kids did, and gradually her reflexive dismissal wavered, and we reached a compromise. She gave me a key to the front door and attached it to a black rope lanyard. I wore it around my neck and felt that there was barely anything left to distinguish me from adults at that point. About a month or so into kindergarten, I rode the bus home as usual, but kept one foot in the aisle this time. I was going to use my key for the first time, and we were nearing my stop. The bus braked, and I was first to stand as I waited for the driver to let us out. I poured out of the bus with the other kids that shared my stop and could see my mom waiting for me on the porch in the distance. As I closed the gap and passed the house that sometimes transformed into an ice palace, I met Mrs. Maggie. "Chris." I didn't turn and barely even noticed the voice. "Chris. It is you." Turning to my left, I saw a thin old woman hustling across her lawn, her floral pattern dress billowing in the warm summer air. I looked to my right and then behind me, but I was the only person in the street. She was calling to me. I started walking faster, but my confusion had slowed my pace, and she caught up with me with her careful but quick steps. The woman stopped in front of me, put her hands on my shoulders, and looked steadily into my eyes. As she closed her eyes tightly and furrowed her brow, I saw beads of tears streak down her cheeks. I tried to move away, but she pulled me into her and wrapped her arms around me as tightly as she could probably manage. "Oh, Chris. I've missed you so." I suppose I was scared by what she was doing, but I wasn't scared of her. She seemed nice, and not knowing what else to do, I dropped my lunchbox, put my right arm around her, and awkwardly rested my still mending, plaster-encased left arm on her side. "Hey." My mom's voice struggled against the wind as she jogged from our porch to where the woman and I stood. My mother gently, but somewhat forcefully, wrestled me from the embrace and told me to go home. As I ran home, I could hear the woman yelling, "Chris," until I vanished into the house. Once inside, I put my backpack on the dining room table and sat down on one of its chairs. I didn't know what had just happened or what was happening right at that moment, but my concern laid mostly on what might happen when my mom came back in. I rested my head against my hand and saw a piece of white paint that had cracked and risen just above the surface of the table. I pinched it between my fingers and peeled it away. It was the first time I vandalized that table. When my mother came back inside the house, I couldn't quite understand what her expression signified, but she didn't seem angry, so I felt relieved. I turned in the chair and faced her. "Who was that lady, Mom?" She smiled at me as she drew closer. "Her name is Mrs. Maggie. She lives in that house you were in front of, the white one. The one with all the ice." "That's the one." "Is she weird?" I asked hesitantly. "No. She's just a little sick, baby. She thought my name was Chris. She kept calling me that over and over again. It's okay, sweetheart. She's a nice lady, so be nice back. But when you get off the bus, you just come straight home, okay?" And that's exactly what I would do. The strange events of the day I met Mrs. Maggie didn't trouble me for long, and if I heard her calling for me by that same wrong name, I would just walk a little faster to my house. About a month later, my cast was removed. Josh and I had talked about swimming in the lake since before the first time he came to my house, but my cast forbid it. I could have tried to protect my arm from the lake water by wearing the latex bag that I used for showers. I considered this, only briefly, though, that bag had failed me before. Once the cast was removed, we took to swimming in the lake immediately, taking advantage of what warm weather remained. I remember how strange and weak my atrophied arm felt as it pushed through the water that first time, and I remember thinking that I'd better not push too hard or it might just snap again. Josh and I got to know Mrs. Maggie fairly well by swimming in the lake almost every weekend, taking a hiatus only when it became time for Mrs. Maggie's yard to freeze again. When winter had passed, and Josh and I returned to the lake in the second half of kindergarten, we still wouldn't accept Mrs. Maggie's invitations or snacks, but one afternoon she surprised us with a different kind of offer. We had expected her to invite us inside again, but this time when we looked toward her as she called to us, we saw her throw a small package into the water like one might throw a frisbee. Hesitantly, but mostly curiously, we swam to it. Josh and I grabbed for it at the same time and wrestled it back and forth, ripping the plastic wrapping as we struggled, and throwing the object into the water. "What is it?" Josh asked. "I dunno. I think we have to unfold it," and so we did, but even after it was fully expanded, it was still hard to identify. We moved it around in the water, turning it in different ways, when finally Josh found an inflation tube jutting out of the gray and black mass. I heard him breathe deep and watched him pour his lungs into it. When he tired, I took over, and as we tread the water, we passed the gift back and forth until it was completely filled. I folded the stopper into the tube, and we flipped our inflated present over. It was a float, one shaped and painted like a shark. We splashed frantically to climb onto it, but each time one of us would make progress, the other would roll the float in an attempt to mount it. As we competed, I glanced at Mrs. Maggie and saw her laughing and clapping her hands. Eventually, we decided to take turns riding it, but the float soon doubled as a mechanical bull as the swimmer would invariably move underneath the shark and push up forcefully in an effort to unbalance the rider. Through all of this, Mrs. Maggie looked on us with a smile shining on her face. As we paddled toward where we exited the lake, we yelled a "thank you" to Mrs. Maggie, and she said that seeing how much we liked it was thanks enough. She always treated us warmly, but there was a variance in her enthusiasm that we could never anticipate or make sense of. Mrs. Maggie was always at least pleased to see us, but there were times where she was simply overjoyed that we were there, swimming just behind her house. That day was one of those days, and as we pulled ourselves out of the water, carrying the float over our heads, she called to us as she sometimes would when she was excited to see us. "Chris. John. You're always welcome here." There were times when we could still hear her yelling those same words as we walked back into my house. We heard her that day. But we were kids, and despite how truly nice Mrs. Maggie was, her quirks sometimes got the best of us. As we carried our new gift up the steps to my house, I opened my front door for Josh. "After you, John." "Oh no. Please." "After you, Chris," Josh snickered. "Oh no. I insist." "After you, John," I rebutted. "Be my guest, Chris." "After you," he returned with the cadence of some crude mixture of English royalty and American upper-class snobbery. "Would you like to come in for some snacks, John?" "Yes, I would, Chris." We laughed as we walked through the doorway at the same time, leaving the float on the steps behind us. I saw my mother standing in the kitchen staring at us. She moved toward us and stopped in front of us. She spoke sharply and firmly. "Don't you ever make fun of her like that again. It's not funny. Do you understand me?" Josh and I looked at one another and then back at her and nodded. My mother smiled and went back to what she was doing, and Josh and I put it out of our minds for the remainder of the day. After Josh left with his dad, I told my mom that we weren't trying to be mean, and we never talked like that in front of Mrs. Maggie. My mom said that didn't matter. She said that it was rude to make fun of anyone whether they were around or not. When I told her that she was constantly calling us by the wrong names, and we just thought it was funny, my mom seemed to search for what she wanted to say. "Well, sweetie, you remember how I told you Mrs. Maggie was sick?" I nodded. Mrs. Maggie is sick, up here." She gestured to her own head with her fingers. "But you remember how, when you had that sore throat earlier this year, sometimes you'd feel okay, but then other times you'd feel really bad? That's how it is for her too. But when Mrs. Maggie gets really sick, she gets confused. That's why she messes up you boys' names sometimes. She doesn't mean to, but sometimes she just can't remember. Do you understand?" I nodded again. "She wants us to come in for snacks sometimes." "I know she does, sweetie. She lives in that big house all by herself, so it's okay if you talk to her when you swim in the lake. But when she invites you in, you should keep saying no, be polite, and her feelings won't get hurt. Okay? But she'll be less lonely when Tom comes home though. How long until he comes back? It seems like he's always gone." My mom seemed to struggle, and I could see that she had become very upset. Finally, she answered me. "Honey, Tom's not going to come home. He's in heaven. He died years and years ago, but Mrs. Maggie doesn't remember. She gets confused and forgets, but Tom's not ever coming home, he's gone, sweetie." I was only 6 years old when she told me that, and while I didn't understand it completely, I was still profoundly sad for Mrs. Maggie. I knew what it was like to miss someone, how much it hurt and tore at you. But to miss someone so much while being so sure that he'd return, never knowing or remembering just how impossible that reunion truly was, I struggled to imagine what that must be like. I wouldn't learn until very recently, however, what Mrs. Maggie's life had really been like. I know now that Mrs. Maggie had Alzheimer's disease. Her husband Tom really had been a pilot. He flew a commercial jetliner all over the eastern United States, and this caused him to spend a great deal of time away from home. After he retired, he and Mrs. Maggie kept mostly to themselves, but every time my mom would run into one or both of them, the conversation would inevitably focus on the trips they wanted to take, if they could only find the time. Tom had discounts with the airline he had retired from, but as is so often the case, their plans were always for someday, and that day kept getting moved further down the line. On the evening of July 4th, years before I was born, Tom came to my mom's house. He was distressed, though he tried to conceal it as he casually asked my mother if she had seen Maggie. He said that she had gone out for some chicken so that he could grill it for the holiday, but that had been almost 6 hours ago. My mom hadn't seen her, but said she would contact Tom immediately if she saw her or heard anything. The police brought Mrs. Maggie home about 5 hours after that. She had wandered from the grocery store and walked to an apartment that she and Tom had shared 30 years before when Tom was just starting his job at the airline. When the police arrived at the apartment, Mrs. Maggie insisted that she lived there with her husband, but when they read aloud the address that was printed on her driver's license, she regained her clarity and covered her embarrassment with nervous laughter. She wasn't hurt when the police brought her home, but Tom was destroyed. He would tell my mom some time later that he had known for a long while that something was wrong with Maggie, but he had hoped that she would just get better somehow. A few days after the police brought his wife home, Tom told my mother that he was planning on taking his wife to Rome. It had been a dream of hers since she was a young girl. Maggie had a collection of books about Rome and Italy at large that were all dog-eared on the pages with the places that she wanted to see. He said that pushing it back was simply not an option anymore. The doctors had told him that the windows of her lucidity would likely grow smaller as time pressed on. Tom began to cry and stammer as he touched his own head and said that he needed to take her now, while she was still here. He wanted her to be there, in the place of her dreams, while she still had a chance of knowing where she was. He wanted her to remember. They were old now, but he thought that they might still do some hiking, and to prepare, he began to exercise by walking around the neighborhood with Maggie. Physically, Maggie was in much better shape than Tom, so he had a lot of ground to cover if he wanted to keep up with her in Rome. He kept the trip a secret from her because he wanted to surprise her, and he justified the new exercise regimen by telling her that the fresh air and exercise would be good for them. They were getting on a plane in 1 month. Tom was worried that he wouldn't be in good enough shape by the time they made it to Rome, so after Maggie went to bed, or before she woke up, he would leave the house and go on extra walks. My mom would see him almost every night when she sat outside on the porch. He would walk briskly through the cool night air, and as he passed our house, she would wave to him, and he would wave back and then bring the hand down to his lips with his index finger extended and pointing straight up, as if to say, "It's our little secret." One night, about 2 weeks before the trip, my mom was sitting outside on the porch and saw, for the first time, Tom jogging. His posture wasn't professional, but he was really moving. She waved to him, but he either didn't see her or was too tired to wave back, because he kept jogging right by the house. She went back inside and went to bed for the night. About an hour later, a knock on the front door jerked my mother out of sleep. She cracked the door enough to see through to the outside and saw a badge. It was a police officer. Behind him, the sky was filled with blue and red flashing lights that were so bright she had to shield her eyes as if the lights were the sun itself. Her first thought was that Maggie had gone missing again, and she was about to ask if that was the case when the officer spoke and then gestured toward her lawn. She squinted and let her eyes adjust just enough to break her heart. Tom had collapsed and died 50 yards from his home, right in front of ours. He had no identification, and so my mother pointed them toward Mrs. Maggie's house and offered to go over there with them, but they declined. She explained Maggie's condition, and they assured her that everything would be fine. My mom took one last look at Tom and went back inside. Mrs. Maggie never found out about the trip her husband was planning for her. She knew he had died because his heart failed him while he was running, but she never knew that he was running for her. Tom and Mrs. Maggie had had 2 sons, Chris and John. After Tom's death, Mrs. Maggie's condition continued to deteriorate. Her sons had apparently worked out payment plans with the utility companies and paid for Mrs. Maggie's water and electricity, but they would never visit her. I don't know if something happened between them, or if it was the illness, or if they just lived too far away, but they never came around. I have no idea what they looked like, but there were times when Mrs. Maggie must have thought that Josh and I looked like they did when they were children. Or maybe she just saw what some part of her mind so desperately wanted her to see, ignoring the images transmitted down her optic nerve, and just for a little while, showing her what used to be. I realize only now how lonely she must have been, and I find myself hoping that she understood why my friend and I never accepted her invitations. But Josh and I were always friendly with her, extending our stay in the lake sometimes to keep her company and talk with her. The day Josh and I had our second discussion with Mrs. Maggie about the balloon project, and she retold the same joke about Tom's plane carrying our balloons away, just a few weeks before the year ended, an idea began to form between us after she mentioned that the lake might extend for hundreds of miles. We had seen much of the woods surrounding my house, and we had explored the woods surrounding his. Although we had never confirmed it ourselves, Josh had found out from his dad that the patches of trees that we played in near our houses were actually connected. When we learned of this, we were extremely excited, not for any particular reason, but knowing that we had been playing in the same woods the whole time, despite whether we were at my house or his, seemed to bring our houses even closer together. But there was still the matter of the lake and its tributary. Mrs. Maggie had said that the lake's appendage might stretch on for hundreds of miles. Since the woods were connected, Josh and I thought, despite Mrs. Maggie's speculation, the lake near my house might somehow connect to the creek around his, so we resolved ourselves to find out. For the last few weekends of kindergarten, our explorations intensified. When our summer vacation started, we would scout during the week and sell snow cones on the weekend. But it quickly became difficult to answer our own question. We needed a way to chart our progress. We needed a way to determine where we had been and where we were going. But we didn't have anything like that, so we had to make it ourselves. We were going to make maps. The plan was to make 2 separate maps and then combine them. We would make one map exploring the area around the creek near Josh's house, and make another following the outflow from my lake. Originally, we were going to make one map, but we realized that wasn't possible since I had started drawing the map of my area so huge that the route from his house wouldn't have fit. We didn't know anything about map making, but we knew from our lessons with the map in the community group that it was important to use the same scale consistently. This didn't involve any math. Following our teacher's explanation of how maps were made, we would just put a little dot on the map for every few steps that we'd take. We kept the map from the lake at my house and the map from the creek at Josh's house, and we would add to each when we stayed the night with each other. Josh was left-handed, and so he would often smudge the lines that he was drawing if he didn't have a flat surface to write on. Because of this, and since my penmanship was better anyway, I did most of the markings on both maps. For the first couple of weeks, it went really well. We would walk through the woods along the water and pause here and there to add to the map. Our pace was slow, and we took breaks on the weekends while we operated the snow cone stand, but despite all this, it seemed like the 2 maps would come together any day. In reality, I am quite sure that the map was incredibly inaccurate, but we did our best. Our procedure was as complex as we could manage. When the bank curved, the line curved. On the upper left corner of each map, we drew a compass rose, but we didn't have a compass, nor did we know how to use one. We weren't even sure which direction north was, but it was on the wall map in our classroom, so we put it on our maps. We were the world's worst cartographers, but we were making progress. The project seemed to be going so well that one afternoon I rerouted our usual path to the woods and took us to a nearby construction site in the neighborhood. From the cinder blocks, I guessed that they were going to place a house like mine on the plot, and the perimeter that was marked with pink-flagged wooden spikes seemed to say that it would be about the same size. I glanced around, and when I saw that no one but Josh and me was around, I jerked one of the spikes out of the ground. We ran back the way we had come and into the woods. We were feeling optimistic and had decided that we must be getting close to finishing our project. In preparation, we thought to impale the earth with a stick each time we reached the end of the day's expedition. If we came upon the stick from the other direction, we would know we had joined the maps. This new strategy also sped up the process because it meant that rather than attempting to use our map to find the point at which we had last stopped, which was nearly impossible, though we ignored this fact, we could simply run through the woods until we saw our stake and extend the map from there. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the woods became too thick near the lake's long arm, and we were unable to proceed further. We debated trying to circumvent the barricade, but this idea forced us to accept that without the constant guidance of the water, our navigation skills were obliterated. Having reached a dead end, our interest in the map stagnated, and we reduced our exploration significantly while we focused on how to make the snow cone stand more successful. I used the time to make a better, albeit deceptive, sign. Just a few weeks later, however, the entire dynamic at my house changed. The weekend my for stamps dollar made its way back to me, my house descended into chaos. Police officers came to our door and talked to my mother and me for hours. One policeman with a thick, black mustache and a striking burn scar on his left forearm and hand had asked for my collection of Polaroids the day the dollar came back. My mother told me to always listen to the police, and so I did what he asked, but I think he could tell I was reluctant. Although he could have easily said nothing at all, the officer told me that he just wanted to borrow them so he could look at them too, and this made me feel better in a way. After they left, I found myself suffocated with new restrictions on what I could do and where I could go, though I didn't understand why this was. My mother told me that the policeman might need to speak with me again, so I had to stay inside, but none of the police who ever came back over the next several weeks seemed to need or want to talk to me. With the snow cone stand gone, Josh and I turned our attention back to the maps with revitalized interest, though our discussions were based on the telephone now. Every day we would call each other to talk about how we would move forward. We were still at the same impasse that caused us to largely abandon the mission almost a month before. Josh struck out on his own and attempted to expand his part of the map from his house, but he wasn't making headway alone. The project seemed to be dead in the water. Gradually, however, my leash grew longer. One weekend, to my surprise, my mom didn't say no when I asked her if Josh could come over, and it wasn't too long after that when we were allowed to play outside again, though now I had to check in frequently. My mom bought me what was the nicest watch I had ever owned, and set about 24 alarms on it, one every 30 minutes from sunrise to dusk. She told me that if I wasn't back between each alarm, then she would take the watch away. She said that I wouldn't need it anymore since I'd be confined to the house from that point on. I couldn't quite understand the need for such a policy, but I was only 6 years old, so of course I assented. If Josh and I were just looking for recreation, this would have presented no challenge, but we had work to do. My mom's new policy meant that we couldn't stay in the woods for hours and continue to look for a new path, and every time we seemed to make some headway, my watch would beep, and we would have to run back to the house. We thought that we could just swim when we got to the cutoff in the woods, but that clearly wouldn't work since the map would get wet. Even if we could keep it dry, the pacing would be ruined, and the accuracy of the map, though there was surely little to begin with, would be compromised. We tried going faster when we were coming from Josh's house, hoping to see the pink-tasseled spike in the ground that would signify that the project was over, but we eventually ran into the same problem of the blockading forest. Then we had a brilliant idea. We'd build a raft. To keep debris off the road and off-site, the construction company began throwing their scrap building material in the ditch, since they no longer needed it for building. We originally conceived of a formidable ship complete with a mast and an anchor, but this quickly diminished into something more manageable. We set aside the wood and took several large and heavy pieces of styrofoam that were backed with thick foam board. After several failed attempts to pilot these individual pieces of debris, we tied them together with rope and kite string in hopes that they wouldn't tip over in the water quite so easily. This project had to be a secret one, because we both knew that my mom wouldn't let us take a raft down the tributary, so we lugged the raft out of the ditch and hid it behind the biggest bushes we could find. We launched our vessel a little downwater from Mrs. Maggie and waved a farewell to her as she motioned for us to come back her way. But there was no stopping us. We had less than half an hour before my watch beeped. The raft worked very well, and while we both behaved and spoke as if the functionality of the raft was a given, I know I was a little surprised. We each had a fairly long tree branch to use as a paddle, but we found it was easier to simply push against the land under the water than it was to actually use them as intended. When the water became too deep, we'd simply lie on our stomachs and use our hands to paddle the water, which still worked, albeit less well. The first time we had to resort to that method of propulsion, I can remember thinking that from far above it must have looked like a colossally fat man with tiny arms was out for a swim. Because our charting had accelerated once we had begun running to the flagged stake, we hadn't realized that the impasse was actually quite a ways away. With each venture, we would be confident in our imminent arrival at the blockade, but the raft moved so slowly that it was taking much longer than expected. So we would sail for as long as we could and then dock the raft. Each time we pulled it onto the shore, Josh would ask me how much farther it was, and I would take the map out of my pocket and count the dots from where I thought we were to where the map ended. "We are, I think, 26 dots from the end," I'd say. And Josh would nod thoughtfully. The next trip, we'd run through the woods directly to the raft, climb aboard, and go a little farther, and there would hopefully, but not always, be fewer dots. We continued this well into first grade. Josh and I were assigned to different groups that year, so since we didn't really see one another during the school day, our parents were more willing to let us play together all weekend each week. Because Josh's dad had taken on a lengthy construction job that required him to work over the weekends while his wife was on call, staying at Josh's house would have been difficult. However, the fact that the telephone at my house had been shut off due to delinquent payments made staying at Josh's house impossible since my mom would have been unable to check on me. For Josh and me, my house became the nexus of our time together, and as much of that time as was possible was spent on the raft. The intensity of the exploration had died down, but it was still fun, so we kept at it. The farther we made it into the woods, the shorter each trip had to be so that we could make it back to my house on time, but this made it more of a game to us. Our movement toward our destination was slow, but finally, at the very beginning of winter, the game became more serious once again. We had made it to the impasse. We wanted to proceed past it right away, but it was nearly time to be back to my house, so we dragged the raft onto the shore and rested it right next to the wooden marker, which we hadn't seen in weeks. We ran back to my house. The next day, we hustled through the woods and made it back to the raft. It was so far into the woods that we had very little time to make adjustments to our plan on scene, so we quickly pushed the vessel into the water and climbed aboard, oars in hand. As we negotiated our way past the woodland obstacle, we found that there was a bend in the water's trajectory that we hadn't been able to perceive before. Scanning our eyes over the edge of the forest, we saw how vast and dense the woods really were in this spot. We realized that we wouldn't be able to overtake this stretch of woods after all, and so we simply stopped paddling. While we sat there on our raft, gently rocking on the calm water, I carefully looked ahead and slowly added to the map, stopping only when I had no more points to plot because the rest lay out of sight, obscured by the curving of the tributary. This felt like cheating, since we hadn't actually traveled to the dots that I was making, but we had waited so long to reach this point that I felt that I had to take advantage of it. Before too long, we had to push back in the other direction. The woods were simply too thick, and the nearly 2-foot rise of earth over the tributary that exposed the twisting and damp roots of the trees above meant that there was no place to dock our vessel. Disappointed, we left the raft at the same thick of trees that prompted us to build it in the first place. Over the course of the next week, we formulated a plan. The phone at my house had been disconnected again that week for missed payments, so the scheming was done piecemeal while waiting for the bus to pull up after school. By the time Josh got to my house the following weekend, I had already completed my part of the mission. I looked at him and attempted to discern if he had come prepared as well. My mother told us that if we were going to go outside, we needed to hurry up. She was cooking dinner, and by the time we got done eating, it would be too late to go back out. We left straight away. "Did you do it?" he asked. "Yeah, are you ready?" "Yeah." We disappeared into the trees. Just 2 days before, I had gone outside to play. Rather than running into the woods, I grabbed the shark float and stealthily carried it to the side of the house. As quickly as I could, I deflated it and rolled it up. Having not considered what I would actually do with it once it had been transformed, I snuck my way to the crawlspace and pried the gateway open just enough to push the now tubular float inside. A little while later, I retrieved it, and as fast as I could, ran into the woods and to the blockade. I tried to inflate the float as I moved, but after tripping over it twice, I abandoned the multitasking and waited until I had reached my destination to finish the job. When Josh and I reached the site, however, our plan seemed to unravel. "I thought you said you brought the float." "I did." Then where is it?" Josh roared. He was already disrobing, revealing the bathing suit that he had put on under his shorts. "I wedged it between the raft and the tree. I even tied it to the tree with a triple knot." "Well, it must have blown away." "That didn't make sense. I had kicked the float hard just before I ran back to my house, because I wanted to make sure it was secure. It hadn't budged even an inch." As I looked around the area hoping to see the float, a strange feeling began to grow inside me. Something was off, but I wasn't immediately sure what it was. The realization struck me hard and fast. "What about the towel though?" "What towel?" Josh returned. "I brought a towel for you, just like we planned. I set it right under the corner of the raft. Do you think it blew away too?" "It doesn't matter now anyway. Let's just go back." And so we did. We had planned for Josh to use the float to help him swim out past the blockade. It was getting too cold for us to leave the house in our swimsuits with my mother's approval, so he had to sneak the suit, just as I had snuck the float. He wouldn't have been able to chart his journey on the map, but if he made it to the end, then at least we would have had some idea of how far it extended. This was our trump card, so to speak. It was our last way of making any real progress, and it had been ruined. It started to seem as if we would never finish the map. But then, finally, we caught a break. On a Saturday evening, around 7 o'clock, Josh and I were eating microwave dinners when one of my mom's co-workers knocked on our door. Her name was Samantha, and I remember her vividly now because, employing what I had learned from watching movies, I would propose to her a couple of years later when my mother brought me to work with her to pick up her paycheck. Samantha would tell me that I was sweet, but maybe we should wait until I was a bit older. Samantha began talking to my mother, and as she did, her gaze became fixed upon Josh and me. She paused for a moment, laughed, and said, "Wow. They really do look alike. You weren't kidding." I had heard my mother say this about us before, but I didn't see it. My mother corralled her co-worker's attention and listened to the rest of what Samantha had to say. After a moment, my mom told Josh and me that we had to go to work with her so she could fix a problem that had arisen. She said that it would take about 2 hours, and I gathered that the problem was Samantha's fault and discussing it in the car was why it wouldn't take more time. We all walked out of the house. My mom seemed apprehensive about bringing us to where she worked. Once, when she couldn't find a babysitter, her boss had formally reprimanded her for bringing me in with her for the day. I opened the rear door of my mother's car and was just about to climb in when I heard her yell. "Shit!" I flinched and stepped down onto the concrete driveway. My mom was leaning over, looking at the deflated front passenger side tire. The sunlight was fading, and she struggled to survey the damage. "What's wrong?" Samantha called, as she stood behind her opened car door. "There's a fucking nail in my tire." She muttered some other profanities and cursed the construction workers that had left their mess in the road, as she ushered us to Samantha's car. She paused when she opened the back door. There were no back seats. "Are you fucking kidding, Samantha?" "I'm having the cushions replaced and reupholstered." After fuming for a moment, she took Josh and me back up to the house and walked us inside. She seemed flustered, but she was still stern as she leaned down in front of us and alternated locking her eyes onto me and then Josh. She said that under no circumstances were we to leave the house or open the door for anyone. There would be a call every half hour from her when she got to work in order to check in on us. She asked if we understood, and we nodded. She looked me dead in the eye as she was closing the door and said, "Stay put." As soon as she closed the door, I walked to the kitchen, took the phone off the base, and held it to my ear. Nothing. Our phone was still disconnected from having not paid the bill, and Josh and I knew this because we had asked my mom to order us a pizza only a couple hours before. She had snapped at me about the phone and told us we could have frozen dinners. She must have forgotten in all the confusion, and I realize now that must have been why Samantha had come by unannounced. Of course, we had no way of knowing whether the phone might be turned back on at any moment, but that thought didn't even cross our minds. This was our chance. We watched my mother and Samantha drive down the serpentine road toward the exit, and as soon as the car rounded the last visible bend, we ran to my room. I dumped my backpack out while Josh grabbed the map. "Hey, do you have a flashlight?" Josh asked. "No, but we'll be back way before dark." I was thinking that we should have one, just in case. "Well, I don't know where one is." "Wait." I ran into my closet and pulled a box down from the top shelf. "You have a flashlight in there?" Josh asked. "Just hold on." I opened the box and revealed 3 Roman candles that I had taken from the pile amassed for July 4th that past summer, along with a lighter that I had managed to take from my mother some months before. These things would ensure that we at least had some light if we needed it. Neither of us was afraid of the dark, and this was a little bit before I had been given an opportunity to be truly afraid of these woods at night, so it wasn't fear that motivated our search for a light source, only practicality. We threw it all in my backpack and bolted out the back door, making sure to close it so that boxes wouldn't get out. We had 1 hour and 50 minutes. We ran through the woods as fast as we could and made it to the raft in about 15 minutes. We had our bathing suits on under our clothes, so we stripped off our shirts and shorts and left them in 2 separate piles about 4 feet from the edge of the water. We untied the raft from the tree, grabbed our branch oars, and cast off. This was it. We tried to move rapidly to reach a point beyond the contents of our ever-expanding map, as we didn't have time to waste seeing old sights. We knew that we were slower in the raft than on land, and that we would be in the raft for quite a while after the cutoff since the woods were too thick to walk through. This meant that we'd have to ride the raft back to the original docking site, even if we found a new place to dock it further ahead. After we passed the last charted part of our map, the water began to get so deep that we found that we could no longer touch the bottom with our tree branches, so we lay on our stomachs with the branches under our chests from left to right and paddled with our hands. The sun was dropping below the canopy, and as a result, it was becoming harder to distinguish the trees from one another. I think we were both too excited to notice how quickly the light was fading. As the sun retreated more, we paddled faster with our arms. The noise of our hands repeatedly confronting and breaking through the water's surface tension was loud, but not loud enough to completely overpower the sound of the crunching of dead leaves and the snapping of fallen sticks in the woods to our right. As we would slow our pace and quiet our actions, the rustling in the woods would seem to cease, and I began to wonder if it was really ever there at all. We didn't know what kinds of animals resided this far into the woods, but I was confident that we didn't wish to find out. As I amended the map that Josh was illuminating with the lighter, we were suddenly confronted with the fact that the sounds were not imagined. Rapidly and rhythmically, we heard the woods speak out. Crunch, snap, crunch. It seemed to be moving slightly away from us, pushing through the woods just beyond our map. It had become too dark to see. We had misjudged how long the sun would linger. Nervously, I called out, "Hello." There was a brief moment of breathless tension as we lay static in the water. The only sound was that of the water gently rolling against the side of our raft. This silence was suddenly broken by laughter. "Hello." Josh cackled. "So what?" "Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods. I know you're sneaking around, but maybe you'll answer to my hello." "Hello." I realized how stupid it was. Whatever animal it was, it wouldn't respond. I hadn't even realized I'd said it until afterwards, but if anything was actually there, I obviously wouldn't get a reply. Josh continued. "Hello," in a high falsetto. "Hello," I countered with as deep a baritone as I could manage. "Hello there, mate." "Hello." Beep boop. We are robots. Helloo. We continued mocking each other with increasingly elaborate salutations, while we dug our arms into the water and moved them in a counterclockwise direction so we could turn the raft back the way we had come. When the front of our raft had pivoted enough that it faced the seemingly impenetrable woods, a sound floated out from them that chilled my blood so much that the winter water just below might have felt temperate. Hello. It was a breathy and airy whisper, the kind you might hear as someone read to himself, broadcasting his voice but not realizing it. It had come from a spot just off the map, which now sat behind us as we slowly drifted away back toward charted territory. Josh and I looked at one another. I could read the fear on my friend's face, and any hope that I had been fooled by my imagination disappeared. All options seemed equal in their futility. We were too slow on the raft to outpace anything. We would be so much faster on land, but we had no feasible way to get onto it, though that was the last place we wanted to be at that moment. I shifted on the raft and faced the direction of the sound as I fumbled with the Roman candle. I wanted to see. "What are you doing?" Josh hissed. But I had already lit it. As the sparking fuse sank into the wrapper, I held it toward the sky. I had never actually shot one of these myself. I thought to just use it like a flare in the movies. A glowing green orb rocketed out toward the stars and then quickly extinguished. I lowered my arm more toward the horizon. I could remember that there were several colors, but I couldn't remember how many times one of these fired before being depleted. A second ball of red light burst out and fizzled above the trees, but I still saw nothing. "Let's just go," Josh pressed, as he turned back toward the direction from which we had come and began paddling desperately. Just one more. Lowering my arm directly at the woods in front of me, another red ball of fire was launched from my paper cannon. It traveled straight ahead until it collided with a tree, briefly exploding the light in a much greater diameter. Still nothing. I dropped the firework in the water and watched as one more struggling fireball burst free, only to die quickly, drowned by the water. Doubt had already started to sink into my mind as we began paddling in the direction of my house. Suddenly, a loud and unconcealed rustling in the woods restored my certainty. The breaking of branches and the trampling of fallen leaves overpowered the sound of our splashing. It was running in the same direction we were pointed. "Come on, man. Paddle," Josh commanded. We were thrashing frantically in an effort to increase our speed. Reflexively, we began trying to kick our legs, which were dangling over the side of the raft, though not touching the water. In our panic, we jostled the raft too violently, and I felt one of the ropes under my chest loosen. "Josh, be careful." But it was too late. Our raft was breaking. I tried to pull the rope taut, but I wasn't strong enough, and Josh began drifting away. I reached for his hand, but not quickly enough. We each held onto a separate piece of styrofoam, but we knew individual pieces wouldn't suffice from when we had first built the raft. We bobbed and rocked as our legs dangled beneath us in the cold water. "Josh! Quick!" I yelled as I pointed at the water right next to him. He scrambled, but it was too cold to move quickly, and we both watched as the map floated away. "What do we do now?" Josh chattered. It was cold. We needed to get out of the water. Swimming directly back wasn't an option, and we couldn't go back into our woods. There were greater problems than the congestion of trees now. I turned my eyes to the other side of the tributary and the woods that bordered it. We had never even thought of going into those trees before, we just didn't consider them part of our woods. They would have to be now, though. This WWI. I began kicking my stiff legs in the water, and Josh followed. We propelled ourselves to the opposite shore. The woods were just as thick on this side of the tributary, but we had no real choice. We abandoned what remained of our raft and clawed our way out of the water and into the alien woods as the sun took its final bow somewhere on the western horizon. Taking care with each step, we marched through the trees and stayed close enough to the water so we could see where we needed to cross when we got there. Our breath steamed in the cool air, and every now and then, a violent shiver would quake through my still-soaked body. We were taking care not to make too much noise, but apparently so was the source of the voice that had greeted us earlier, because our footsteps were the only sounds. Suddenly, the sound of a cracking branch echoed somewhere in the distance. Josh and I stopped and held each other's gaze. Too afraid to talk, Josh mouthed the words, "What do we do?" I shook my head and brought my finger to my mouth, telling him to keep quiet while we listened. Every part of me was screaming to run, except for the one that was too scared to do anything at all, and so we just stood there. There was another cracking limb. I held my breath. It was answered by the sound of dead leaves being crushed. I looked at Josh and could barely see his tears through my own. Crunch snap no. He's running. I thought I had said this aloud, but I suppose I actually hadn't, because Josh yelled to me as I ran furiously away from the stampeding sound behind us. We were running fast, but not fast enough, the sound was getting closer. We leapt over decaying trees and tore through thorn bushes. The sound was just behind us now. There was no way we could outrun it, it would overtake us any second. I wanted to look back, but I forced myself to stare ahead. "Josh, the woods!" I yelled. Just ahead, the trees were tangled in a gnarled mass that would be too thick to run through. Should we dive into the water? Could we charge through the dense woods in front of us? Josh didn't say anything. He seemed at as much of a loss as I was. In a flash, Josh grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a large oak tree. We stood there like statues. The sound stopped. Steam billowed out of our mouths and into the frosty air as we tried to catch our breaths. I covered my mouth with my hand to conceal the blasts of visible air, and I motioned to Josh to do the same. There was a rustling behind us. I leaned my back against the tree to steady my shaking legs so my feet wouldn't audibly grind the leaves under them. We tried to be as quiet as possible. We waited, shivering against the tree and sensitive to the sound of every movement behind us. Perhaps it was too dark for our pursuer to see where we had hidden. Perhaps if we quietly stood there for long enough, it would be over. Beep beep. Beep beep. Beep beep. My watch. The last alarm for the day was sounding. I smashed my fingers on the buttons, but the cold had numbed my hands, and fear had clouded my mind. I couldn't remember how to stop it. Hundreds of times. I had silenced that alarm hundreds of times, but there I stood fumbling and trembling, unable to end its high-pitched death knell. "Stop it," Josh pleaded. "I'm trying," I whimpered. The rustling behind us began to move. It was getting closer now. I tore at my wrist and yanked at the plastic clasp and rubber band until it finally came off. With a whipping of my arm, the watch landed and sunk into the water. But it was too late, the crunching and snapping was right next to us now. We had nowhere to run anymore. I closed my eyes tightly, squeezing tears out of them, which rolled down my face. Defeated and terrified, I collapsed at the base of the tree and wrapped my arms around my knees, pressing them to my chest. A figure appeared in my peripheral, emerging from its hiding spot on the side of the same tree that we had hoped would conceal us. I turned my head so my eyes could take it in. It was a deer. I stared at it in disbelief, and it stared back at me in what might have been confusion or curiosity. It was the closest I had even been to a deer before, or since, for that matter. Even in the poor light of the pale moon, I could see the texture of its fur and the moisture on its nose. "Get out of here!" Josh snarled in a tantrum, apathetically throwing a small stick at the creature. It bounded off into the woods. We could still hear it long after it had disappeared from sight. We trod through the woods, moving as the dead might move. Exhausted by both fear and the winter air, we didn't speak another word until we had arrived at the point from which we had departed, only now we were on the opposite side of the water. The tributary was narrower here, but neither of us wanted to get back into the water to cross. Josh asked me what I thought we should do, but I didn't respond. I thought that if we continued through the woods along the water, we would get to the lake, and we could just circle around it. But that would take far too long. I didn't have my watch anymore, so I didn't even know what time it was. For all I knew, my mother could be home already. There was no time. "We have to cross here," I said. As quickly as we could, we moved through the water and onto the opposite shore. The earth sloped into the water here, so we were able to simply walk out of it and back onto familiar ground. We took off our swimsuits and were desperate to get into dry clothes that would shield us from the biting chill of the air. I slid on my shorts, but there was something wrong. I turned to Josh. "Where's my shirt?" He shrugged and gestured toward the water. Maybe it got knocked into the water and floated into the lake. As he motioned, I saw one of the pieces of our styrofoam raft floating in our direction, back toward the lake. I told Josh to go back to my house and to say that we were playing hide and seek if my mom was home. I had to try to find my shirt. I ran behind the houses and peered out over the water while scouting along the shoreline. It occurred to me that with any luck I might find the map too. If the raft had floated this way, then maybe the map had. I was moving fast because I needed to get home, and I was about to give up when my concentration was interrupted by a sound coming from just behind me. "Hello." I whipped around. It was Mrs. Maggie. In the porch light, she looked incredibly frail, and the usual warmth that wrapped her manner seemed to have been snuffed out by the chill. I couldn't remember ever seeing her without a smile, and so her face looked strange to me. "Hi, Mrs. Maggie." "Oh. Hi, Chris." The warmth and smile had returned to her, even if her memories had not. "I couldn't see it was you in the dark there. What are you doing out so late?" "JJ, just playing with a friend." Now that my rapid movements had stopped, the cold had started to creep into me again, and I could feel my teeth chatter against themselves. I was beginning to feel weak. Each breeze seemed to drive the icy water on my skin through it and down to my bones. "And Mrs. Maggie," I thought for a moment and collected myself. "Mrs. Maggie, CC and I come inside. I just need a tea towel." My head began to swim. "Not right now, Chris. Bother, how do I put this?" She seemed to search for the words, as I half-heartedly searched for my missing shirt and any scrap of paper that might be the map. She spoke out again at the same time I did, and her voice fell dully on my ear. "Mrs. Maggie, have you seen OM's home?" I felt the world drop out from under me. Mom's home. Had she just said that? She was still talking, but I couldn't hear her anymore. I abandoned my search immediately and ran around the side of her house. I could hear Mrs. Maggie running through her house parallel to me. My legs felt weak, but I pushed them hard against her concrete driveway. My stomach twisted when I saw my mom's car in our driveway, but then I remembered that she hadn't taken her car. I thundered down toward the street and could hear Mrs. Maggie walking briskly across her frozen yard behind me, the ice-covered grass snapping and crunching beneath her feet, but I didn't look back. Instinctively, I ran around the house and went to the back door. I eased it open. I couldn't hear anything, no yelling, no talking, not a single sound. I slid into the bathroom that connected to my bedroom and cracked the door open. I heard Josh yell, and I flung the door open the rest of the way. "You scared the crap out of me," he protested. "Is my mom home?" No, the tightness in my stomach relaxed, and I could feel my whole body slump a little in relief. Had I heard Mrs. Maggie right? I suppose that it wasn't very surprising that she could be wrong about Mom being home when she had trouble remembering what my name was. Josh had already changed his clothes and was looking much more comfortable than I felt. I went into my closet, stripped the wet clothes off, and put some dry ones on. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later that my mom came home. We'd actually gotten away with it, even though we'd lost the map. Couldn't find it? No, I looked hard, but I didn't see it. I saw Mrs. Maggie, though. She called me Chris again. She's pretty scary at night. Don't you ever make fun of her like that. Understand? Josh whispered in a mocking tone so that my mom wouldn't overhear. We both laughed, and he asked me if she had invited me in for a snack, joking that the snacks must be terrible since she couldn't even give them away. I told him that she hadn't, that I had actually tried to invite myself in and been rejected, and he was surprised. As I thought about it, it really was surprising. Nearly every time we had seen her, she had invited us in for snacks, and here I had invited myself, and she said no. But she had evidently thought that my mom was home, so maybe it wasn't so strange that she didn't want me to come in. The subject turned to what had happened in the woods. We discussed it at the lowest possible volume. We were no longer sure about what we had heard. When Josh mentioned the Roman candle, it occurred to me that the lighter I had taken on the raft might still be in my pocket, even if we had gotten away with our secret mission. If my mom found a lighter in my pocket, the penalty would be severe. The fact that I had thrown my watch into the water and would have to explain why I no longer had it was slowly presenting itself to my attention, but I subdued its nagging while I grabbed the shorts off the floor and patted my pockets. I felt something, but it wasn't the lighter. I squeezed it and felt it crinkle in my hand. From my back pocket, I removed a folded piece of paper, and my heart leapt. The map? I thought desperately. But I watched it float away. As I unfolded the paper, my palms began to sweat as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Drawn on the paper inside of a large oval were two faceless stick figures holding hands, one much bigger than the other. The paper was torn so a part of it was missing, and there was a number written near the top right corner, either 15 or 16. I nervously handed Josh the paper and asked him if he had put it in my pocket at some point, but he scoffed at the idea. I put the question to him again, hoping he would change his answer, that he had just forgotten that he'd done it. He denied it again and asked why I was so upset. I pointed toward the smaller stick figure and what was written next to it. It was my initials. Josh kept talking, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My eyes were stuck on the piece of paper. I had to continuously and actively refocus my vision, which would blur as my mind meandered trying to make sense of it. I put the drawing in my collection drawer, and Josh went home the next day. I had always attributed the odd exchange with Mrs. Maggie to her being sick, the product of a mind too young to understand and a mind too old to remember. She was such a lonely woman, and although I was too young to appreciate that fully, there must have been some part of me that did, because I never went out of my way to correct her when she called me by the wrong name. That night was the last time I saw Mrs. Maggie. It was the last time her yard would be transformed into an Arctic kingdom by her poorly timed sprinklers. But, as a kid, you just accept that people come and people go. That's just the way the world is. They have their own lives, and as they live them, sometimes that takes them out of yours. Only later do you look back and ask yourself, what happened? Where did they go? I didn't understand why Mrs. Maggie had left. I didn't understand what I was watching weeks later when I saw men in strange, orange biohazard suits carry what I thought were black bags full of garbage out of her house, leaving the whole neighborhood blanketed in a faint but festering smell of decay. I still didn't understand when they condemned the house and boarded it up. But I understand now. I understand that I had simply gotten the warning wrong. I thought she had tried to alert me to go because my mom was home. But that wasn't it. I had heard what I'd been listening for, just as Mrs. Maggie had always seen what she was looking for. Had I been listening more attentively and less selfishly, had I had the capacity to recognize just how profound her confusion and loneliness really were, then maybe I would have heard the warning that she was really giving me, even though she didn't realize that it was a warning. She never said, "Mom's home." She had told me, with an explosion of misguided joy, what could only be meaningful to me now that I can't do anything that would truly matter. Those men weren't carrying garbage in those bags. I am as certain of that as I am of what Mrs. Maggie said that night and who had really come home, regardless of what name she called him. That night, she told me, "Tom's home."